Okay, so thank you, Michael Grunwald, for coming on to a Future Foods interview. Now, you're a journalist and a writer, and you've just written a book called "We Are Eating the Earth." So, are you on a bit of a mission to save the planet, Michael?
Maybe an unlikely mission. Well, what I will say is that, I've written about environmental issues and climate issues for a while. And it was really about, 6 or 7 years ago, I realized I didn't know anything about the food part of the problem, and it was a third of the problem. So I will say, I don't think the world has grappled with these issues as much as I should. And I would say I'm on a mission to get people to grapple.
Okay. So what was your reason for writing the book? And also, what surprised you the most in your time writing it? And also just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, actually. There's a lot to deal with there, but let's just get an introduction of
Sure.
your
Sure.
background.
Well, I've been a reporter and mostly a policy reporter for 30 years. I was at the Washington Post, I was at Time Magazine, Politico Magazine. And like I said, I had done my first book was about the Everglades. My second book was about Obama. So I've done a lot of environmental reporting and political reporting, and climate reporting, and really realized that I was spectacularly ignorant about the food part of the climate conversation, right? That there's there are a million books about energy and climate, and uh, and we kind of know what to do about energy, right? We want to you know electrify the global economy and run it on clean electricity. And obviously, we're not doing it fast enough, but we actually have, started to make some real progress, and we're having this clean energy revolution. But the food part of the problem, felt like we don't even really know what to do, and we haven't really started to do anything. And as I started to get into it, I realized not only is there so much we don't know, but a lot of what people think they know just isn't so. So that's really what, I realized that this was this kind of huge white space. And so I sort of tried to dive into it. And 6 years later, I'm perhaps less spectacularly ignorant than I was.
Okay, so it's taken you 7 years to write this book, has it?
Well, I first got the idea 7 years ago. It took about 5+ years of working on it, and I finished late last year. So,
Okay,
uh,
and it's
and
going
there
to
was
be released.
a little bit of a COVID break when suddenly I was covering it like everybody else. But yeah, about 5 years of work.
Okay, and it's due to be released in a couple of weeks. Is that about
It's
right?
July 1st is
Right,
the
first.
actual drop date.
Okay, so I posed this question earlier. So, what surprised you the most in writing this book, would you say?
Uh, Let's see. Well, I would say I was surprised initially, after having spent so much of my life. I did a lot of Washington reporting and was sort of aware of all these kind of, I'd been covering the massive political culture war in the United States and in some sense globally. Um, and I thought that food would be a little bit of a break from that. It'd be good to actually just get into the facts and away from these kind of culture war ideologies. But what I discovered was that in food and ag, there's this kind of different culture war, right? Where you have the different silos, no pun intended, where you have the industrial people and the regenerative people and the vegan people, and sort of ne'er the twain shall meet, right? Um,
Yeah.
when I sort of over time kind of felt that they had a fair amount to learn from each other. But yeah, I guess certainly having read Michael Pollan, and at least being exposed to, in climate world where there's this basic idea, it's sort of left of center people who tend to go to the farmers market and have this idea of what sustainable farming is. Certainly as I sort of started digging into this idea of regenerative ag and organic farming, and realized that what's so important for us to stop eating the earth is for us to make more food with less land, that and that sort of put it in a new light, right? That this isn't just about, how nice you treat your soil. It's about what we're doing for the planet and, how much food we can make, and that these are kind of systemic issues. And then I guess also related to that, once I started looking into this carbon farming idea that are in these movies like Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, where, if we just sort of have kinder and gentler farming, that all that carbon that we've pumped into the atmosphere is going to be sort of miraculously resettle in our soils. That turned out to be mostly bogus.
Right.
And so that was a bit of a surprise.
Yes, I suppose. I mean, I've often found this as well. When you speak to individuals about this, they have a very kind of individualistic approach to it. So they kind, like you say, they talk about their personal shopping habits. And in the book, you're quite critical of some of the romantic ideas of regenerative grazing and organic farming. So, what do you think are the unintended consequences of these approaches?
Sure. I mean, well, I guess what I should say is like, the main thing I discovered when I started looking at this is, and says it in big letters on the bright orange cover, is that we are eating the earth. Right. And this seems something you're in the food world. You've been thinking about this all the time. But I think most of us, like I live in Miami, in a city. I've lived in cities all my life. I've written a lot about urban sprawl, this idea that our cities and suburbs are kind of like, expanding into nature. But it turns out that cities and suburbs and highways and driveways and the developed area of the world where most of us spend our time is about 1 of every 100 acres on Earth. And agriculture is 2 of every 5, right? We've converted a natural planet into an agricultural planet. And we're on track to deforest another 12 Californias worth of land by 2050. So that turned out to be the central struggle of this book, is that we are going to need 50% more calories by 2050. That we cannot keep expanding our agricultural footprint and shrinking our natural footprint. We're going to need to reduce our agricultural emissions by 80%. And so what do we do? And the fact is that organic and regenerative agriculture, which, we can talk about, and there's some really great things about it, but in general, not always, but in general, they have lower yields. So they make less food per acre. And that means they need more acres to make food. And that is the problem, because the real environmental disaster of agriculture, and look, we need agriculture because we need to eat, but it's using 70% of our fresh water. It's like the biggest source of wetland destruction and deforestation and water pollution. But the big problem is just that it is using so much land. We have, there's when you transform nature into agriculture, that's when you lose the biodiversity and the carbon. And then when you intensify that, the nice bucolic Michael pollen farms that are diverse and not soaked in chemicals and not monocultures, there is an environmental cost there. But the big environmental cost is just the transformation of nature into agriculture, and so a lot of my focus is how can we prevent that?
Mm. So, I mean, so give us an idea then from your research. What is the worst case scenario? What will happen if we do nothing and just sort of carry on the way we're going?
Yeah, well, the sort of environmental line about how there's no planet B. I mean, we're gonna need one. Those what I said about the dozen Californias worth of land, that actually assumes that farm yields keep increasing actually even a little faster than they've increased since the Green Revolution. And with climate change and these, increased floods and droughts and heat waves and, pests and diseases moving to new regions, that's going to be a drag on yield. So that's going to be really hard. And of course, we can't just, invent fertilizer like we did in the 60s and 70s, because it's already invented and most farmers already have it. So the worst case scenario is actually probably 3 dozen California's worth of land. And of course, we do not have 3 dozen California's worth of forest that we can spare. Even if we cut off all fossil fuels tomorrow, we are still on track just from food and agriculture to blow past our climate targets by 2050. Right now it's a third of the problem, but as we start to deal with, the energy side of the problem, it's going to become more and more. And when I say it's a third of the problem, that doesn't that doesn't include the notion that our forests are already soaking up about a quarter of our carbon emissions. So when you get rid of those forests, not only are you pumping all that carbon into the sky, but you're eliminating its ability to soak up carbon in the future. I say that like trying to decarbonize the planet while we're continuing to vaporize trees, it's like trying to clean your house while you're smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room, right? It's like
Yeah.
you're not only making a mess, but you're crippling your ability to clean up the mess. So I try not to be, catastrophic and Debbie Downer about this stuff, but these are really big problems and we are not yet addressing them and we do need to.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned in the book that already the rainforest is no longer a carbon sink.
That's right.
So it's already kind of past the tipping point in a way in that regard, right?
Well, we'll see about the tipping points, but there's a lot of scary science about things that could happen, and certainly not as good as, the Amazon is not as good a sink as it used to be. And this is, the reason I'm banging my spoon on my high chair about this is that, most of us who live in these cities, we don't necessarily think about this, except maybe when we take a flight and we look out the window and we see all those squares and circles. It's like, oh, wow, there's a lot of agriculture out there. But the world is losing a soccer field worth of, you might call it football, I guess, a football pitch worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds, and that is not
Yeah.
sustainable. And so that is why I'm kind of waving my hands in the air and saying like, hey, I'm not saying that the world is coming to an end tomorrow. I'm not saying that everybody has to go vegan because what's the point in saying that? I'm not even vegan myself. I've just cut out beef. But we do need to make changes because the current trajectory just, it ain't working.
Yeah, I mean this is the big I suppose we can shout about these things as much as we want, but really how is change going to come? Because
Right.
people are okay to kind of ask other people to change, but when they are called upon to sort of change their own lifestyles, I mean, I'm a little bit like you, Michael, really. I'm not a vegan, but I have kind of significantly cut down my intake of meat. And I suppose the point of what I do in regard to kind of promoting alternative proteins is for people who like meat to have an alternative. It's not for vegans, it's not for vegetarians. And
Right.
that demand for meat and beef and is only set to increase. And you've written about that in your book. So I mean, what is the answer really? What do what have you come up with?
Well, as I write about dozens of really promising solutions in the book. Now, granted, none of them have like a ton of traction yet, and so one of the solutions is that just like we did with energy, I like to say food is probably 20, 25 years behind energy. There was real government investment in research and then deploying the kind of the solutions that work that we have not really seen yet in the food and ag space. So I do think that's part of the problem. I do that like alternative proteins, I think are an excellent example of, some people are already saying like, oh, it's a fad, it's done, it's over, or ew, people will never eat technology, which I think is kind of silly. Um, but uh, but yeah, I think that's a perfect example of, you see what happened with electric vehicles, right? Where, you know, once you started to see some stuff that was cheaper and better than the current internal combustion engine, you actually started to see some progress and starting to move the needle. And in some places, you see oil demand is actually reducing. And you could imagine that with meat, right? I mean, right now you've got these alternative proteins that are mostly on the plant-based meat side, and they were better than the old kind of veggie hockey pucks, but they weren't as good as meat, and they weren't as cheap as meat. And so people who weren't, committed to, saving the planet or saving animals, didn't really embrace it. And so, Beyond Meat, which was $250 a share, is now $2 a share. And everybody's, we're in the trough of disillusionment and everybody's talking shit about it. But
Yeah.
but my sense is like, if it can be more delicious and cheaper, that people will, that could be a real solution. And
Yeah.
uh and I write about all kinds of solutions, from alternative fertilizers to alternative pesticides. There are guys in the University of Illinois trying to reinvent photosynthesis with artificial intelligence and gene editing. There are, I you can tell I'm like really fun at parties. I write about biological nitrification inhibition. I mean, there are all kinds of really cool stuff happening and really smart people working on them. But again, they have to work, and then they have to get to scale, because right now that's not happening.
So summarize for us, Michael, a little bit about of the problems with intensive beef and kind of animal farming.
Right.
What's wrong with eating a steak?
Sure. I mean, yeah, and that's yes, like we eat 350 million tons of meat a year. And two-thirds of our agricultural land is pasture. And really about three-quarters of it, if you include the crops that we feed to animals, about three-quarters of our agricultural land supports livestock. So yes, it turns out that eating plants directly is way less resource intensive than laundering the plants through an animal.
Mm.
It takes eight calories of feed of plants basically to feed to a chicken to create 1 calorie worth of meat. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, it turns out that cattle are the real baddies and other ruminants. Cattle are like 10 times worse than chicken and pork. Um, so the real problem is that these animals are kind of inefficient converters of their feed into our food. So they end up using a lot of land. It takes a lot of land and that means deforestation. That means wetland drainage. That's the basic problem. Obviously, the ruminants also, they have other problems where they're burping and farting a lot of methane. All of these animals also have manure problems, and that creates both emissions and also a big mess. In general, animal agriculture, and that doesn't even get into the idea that, a lot of these factory farms, they treat animals badly, they treat people badly. Most of the people running them have terrible politics. They're lobbying against environmental regulation and climate action. They're using too many antibiotics, which is creating a public health menace. So there are all these problems with agriculture, and in particular animal agriculture. And I get it. I get it why people are upset. Um, but then the flip side is, when you're talking about, well, people still want a lot of meat, and how are we going to supply it? Um, Again, it's like, how much food can we produce with how much land? And say what you will about factory farms, one thing that factories are really good at is manufacturing a lot of, affordable commodities on a grand scale. And factory farms do create, a lot of food, while, for instance, grass-fed beef and organic grass-fed beef, which a lot of people say, like, we don't need to less beef, we just need better beef. Well, actually, from a climate and planet perspective, it's worse. It takes longer to get the cows to slaughter weight, so they burp and fart more methane, and it's not as efficient, so they use a lot more land, and that means more deforestation. And
Yeah.
you know, it's these are tough trade-offs, and I'd like to be able to, if I just wrote a book saying like it's easy, everybody goes vegan and we're done, or just, everybody wastes less food and the problem is solved.
Mm.
It would I'd be a lot more popular. But the fact is, all agricultural solutions are imperfect, and this notion that there's kind of like a kinder and gentler and wonderful agriculture that's going to be really awesome for the environment, as opposed to this like current agriculture that makes a mess, that's just not true.
It's not a topic that people want to talk about, is it? I find myself, that it's kind of best not to mention too much to everybody the sort of stuff I'm working on, because kind of lots of people screw their noses up, or they kind of sort of think that there's something wrong with you, or they just don't really want to be faced with this particular problem. I mean, we as human beings, we feel we have earned the right to eat meat. We feel like it's a natural thing for us to do, and who is in a position to kind of take away that right from us, which clearly is why politicians try to leave the topic alone and steer well clear of it.
I talked to this a pollster who I know who told me that taxes and other restrictions on meat are the least popular policy of any government policy that he has ever polled. He said it's up there with veterans benefits for ISIS. So, you know, I think uh, the
Yeah.
politics are really hard. And yes, you can see it in the United States, where anytime you start, like when I start talking about food and climate change, it's like, oh, you're going to make us all eat bugs, or oh, you're going to ban
Mm.
cows.
Yeah.
And there has been a sense that, these, plant-based burgers, the Impossible Burgers, the Beyond Burgers, they immediately became part of the political culture wars, right? They're Biden
Mm.
burgers in the same way that a while back, like electric vehicles were seen as Obama mobiles. And that is a problem. And what I always tell people is that like hard things are hard. Um, and
Mm.
you've seen in Denmark, like that's the flip side, right? And I know it's Denmark, right? So,
Perfect in
there's
Denmark.
6 million people. They're like the model country. Everybody loves it there. But it was funny. I went there well, I know exactly when it was because it was February 2020. Because when I left at the airport, they were like, "Have you been in China?" And I was like, "Why are you asking me if I've been in China?" And they were like, "Oh, there's some virus."
Oh
I
wow.
was like,
Yeah.
"Oh." So
The
yes,
good
but I
old
went
days.
there. I went there with the main character of my book, who's sort of the guy who figures all this stuff out. And he had been hired by the Danish agriculture lobby, essentially, to try to figure out how they can decarbonize their operations, because they were under incredible pressure. Because Denmark has done such an excellent job decarbonizing their energy sector, that suddenly the ag guys, it was like their turn in the barrel. Like they were outliers, like they were the only ones not doing anything. And all the enviros were like, shut down the Danish, make them get rid of their pigs, make them get rid of their cows, shut them down. And they were like, well, we're super efficient. What can we do? And actually, that would have been a really bad idea to shut down their pigs and cows because they do it very efficiently. And that would have just moved production to less efficient places that would have outsourced more deforestation and pollution. But the
Mm.
long story short is that 5 years later, Denmark passes this massive reform bill that taxes agricultural emissions, forces farmers to return about 1 million acres of their farmland to nature, but also does not shut them down. In fact, gives them money and helps them to adopt technologies that are going to make them even more productive and make less of a mess. They're going to test some of these things that we ought to be testing all over the world, the kind of feed additives to help the cattle burp less methane, and the, gene edited crops that are going to be drought tolerant and flood tolerant and heat tolerant. And they're going to do all the things. They're even going to have a nationwide effort to push plant forward eating. And so, it can be done.
Mm.
um, that said, it's really hard.
I suspect that in Scandinavian countries such as Denmark, the population trust their government perhaps a little bit more than they do in the US or in the UK recently. So
Yeah, you're probably right. And look, I mean, there's been this rise of kind of right-wing populism that has been very tied to the agricultural interests in just about every country, including the United States, where it's popped up. And you know what? Even Denmark, I do sometimes I get in trouble when I point this out, but those, the agricultural emissions taxes that everybody's all excited about, they don't really go into effect until 2030. And New Zealand had passed an agricultural emissions tax, and it somehow got repealed right before it went into effect. So, you know, uh, like these things are really hard, and that is one of the lessons of the book that I repeat over and over again, that there's not going to be one solution. They're going to need to be a ton of solutions, both on the demand side and the supply side, and none of them are going to be easy. All of them are going to take work. Some of them are going to fail. Um, but better is better than worse, right?
yeah.
Perfect probably isn't on the menu.
I suspect that that any kind of solution isn't going to come from government anyway. It's going to come from industry, isn't it? I mean, I suspect that what needs to happen, rather than kind of telling people to stop doing one thing, they need to be encouraged to start doing something better. And that will come from kind of it being cheaper, more convenient, and kind of tasting good, and people sort of saying, well, I can do this and it's great, and it's good for the planet and it's good for animals. It ticks all the boxes, so I'm going to start doing that.
I would say I almost entirely agree with you. I mean, look, like human beings seem to be like, we're not so great at being nice to each other, right? We're not so great at making sacrifices for the planet or for our futures, right? For our grandchildren. But we're really good at inventing stuff.
Yeah.
I've got this thing in my pocket that I can like video chat with anybody anywhere on the planet and look up any fact known to mankind and also use it as a flashlight. Like a few years ago, everybody would have said like, if you said that, that would have been science fiction. So I do have a lot of confidence in these smart people who are working on solving these problems. Alternative proteins being a great example, cultivated meat, which behind the scenes they're making incredible progress. But there's also some guy in Nepal who's, on a shoestring budget trying to turn rice straw into usable animal feed. And, since we have like 500 million tons of rice straw every year, like that would be a really big deal. So yes, I do think I have a lot of confidence in innovation. But that said, certainly in the United States, which has really been, for all our faults, like we've been at the forefront of a lot of innovation, and the government has always been a partner on that stuff. Energy is the perfect example where, the early investments in wind and solar and electric vehicles and even fracking, the shift from coal to natural gas. There was all a lot of government investment, and then there was government deployment, right? Once we found stuff that worked, subsidies and what we just haven't seen that on the food and ag side. There's plenty of subsidies just in $300 billion a year globally that's just handed to farmers, but there hasn't been the kind of investment in, particularly on the climate side, and the kind of solutions that would really move the needle. Cultivated meat, for example, has had in all of its history, public and private investment, about $3 billion, while in the first quarter of this year, there was $250 billion invested in solar. So, you can see, I think there's going to have to be a little bit more of an effort to help with these technologies. But ultimately, I do have more faith in technology than humans just deciding, what, we've been doing this wrong. Let's change our behaviors, because that doesn't seem to be our value added as a species.
No. I was told by someone at the GFI, Claire Lane, I think it was,
Uh-huh.
that we need to be investing. I've forgotten the exact figure, but it might have been 11 billion a year into this industry in order for it to really kind of take off.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I think no, I think that
I'm talking about
yeah,
sort of
altern
cultivated meat, the
alternative proteins,
alternative
man.
proteins. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I tell the story. I actually started my reporting for this book. I went to the GFI conference in 2019, and this was right after Beyond Meat went public, and it was like there were serious discussions on the stage of whether it was going to take 10 or 20 years to get rid of the meat industry. And it wasn't like just like crazy hippies or techno freaks talking about it. It was like people from Archer Daniels Midland and Tyson and Cargill were having these discussions. I mean, the exuberance was just off the charts. My joke was that I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round in the drinks line. I mean, it was just absolute, classic irrational exuberance. And then I went back as I was finishing my reporting in 2023 to the GFI conference, and it was all doom and gloom. It was like, what were we thinking? This was a fad. How could we take, what we tried to take on this $1 trillion industry, and the $1 trillion industry won. Like obviously all the investment had dried up. Now the new thing was AI. Everybody was trying to rebrand themselves as an AI meat company. And again, to me, it felt like this is a little excessive. There's been incredible progress. It's just, it hasn't succeeded in the marketplace yet. And obviously, a lot of those companies are going to end up failing. And who knows, maybe the Cargills and Tysons and ADMs of the world are just going to sweep up their carcasses and take over the business.
Yeah.
But I still have a lot of faith that, that rather than growing a cow, which has hooves and a tail and a reproductive system, and it breathes and poops and does all kinds of things that don't make meat, that actually like kind of just brewing it in a brewery could
Yeah.
ultimately be a lot more efficient. And I've tasted this stuff and it tastes great. So why not? It's just, it's going to take some time. I still have a lot of confidence in the future of technology and the smart people working on it, but it hasn't happened yet. And it is like the clock is ticking. Like,
Yeah.
this is one of these things where sooner would be better than later.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly for companies like Cargill and JBS, they don't necessarily mind or care where their meat comes from as long as they have meat to sell, right? And
That's right.
speaking to Jeff Trepition from Meatable, who worked his life in the meat industry, now is CEO of Meatable, that is a cultivated meat
Yeah.
company. He was telling me that their proposition is to supply the meat companies with 25% cultivated meat. So you'd get a
To
burger,
blend it.
yeah, so you'd have like 75% kind of butchered meat, 25% cultivated meat. And that's kind of fixing 25% of the meat problem. And
Yeah.
it sounds like a great solution. No one will know the difference.
Right.
It'll
And you're seeing that even like the first US company that just got approval, and they're going to hopefully be in grocery stores soon, is Mission Barnes.
mm,
They're making
fact.
cultivated fat, and they're mixing it into a plant-based meatball essentially, and it's only 10% maybe of the it's only 10% animal cells. But fat, as you know, is like a big part of what makes meat so delicious. And it turns out that fat is a lot easier to make than muscle.
Yeah.
Which, when you think about it in our own bodies, right? Which is easier to make, fat or muscle?
Yeah.
You can make
Good
fat
point.
sitting on the couch, and muscle you have to go to the gym. So, and so I've tasted those meatballs and they're good. They taste like meatballs. There's something about the actual animal cells that sends, like, I call it 2 million years of evolution saying hi. And so, yeah, I do think there are going to be these gradual solutions. I think about how Tesla started with the Roadster, right? Which was this like $150,000 sports car that they only sold like a couple thousand of. But that helped them, raise money to build the Model S, which was like 80,000. And now they have the Model 3, which is like really a mass market car for $45,000. And people love it. So again, I think, I like Wild Type just got a approval to do cultivated sushi,
Yeah.
salmon sushi, right? And
Yeah.
uh, and I know like Blue Nalu is making cultivated
Fish.
bluefin tuna
Tuna.
tuna toro, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, why would you start with such a niche product, right? Well, because it goes for $100 a pound, so you can actually compete with that, and then maybe you can, that can get you to scale. So I do think there's again, it's going to take time, and we don't have endless time. It's one thing I talk about in the book is that we should stop with these solutions that are making things worse,
Mm.
whether that's like using land for biofuels or, waste, having these kind of big transition to lower yield agriculture that makes more food and drives more deforestation, or even just on the energy side, right? Like in the United States, there's this movement to ban solar panels and wind turbines on farmland. It's like,
Yeah.
no, we should, let's fix that energy problem faster, and that might buy us a little time to fix food. Again, I
Yeah.
just think it's not going to be solved tomorrow, but a lot of people are working on it, and I'm trying to say like, hey, look, there are a lot of people working on this very serious problem. They could use some help, and at the very least they could use us not kind of crapping on them and saying like, "Ooh, you're trying to put technology in our food," or like, "Ooh, you're editing those crops, that's disgusting." It's like, hey, people are trying to solve problems here.
It's the natural or unnatural argument, isn't it? Which
Yeah.
kind of comes up all the time. But obviously, kind of, if they saw what happened in an abattoir, they probably wouldn't consider that particularly natural.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh, it's processed food. I'm always like, do you know what happens inside a cow's stomachs? Like that's a process, you know? Yeah, no,
True.
exactly. I
Yeah.
in the now they're going after they're going like there are these ads where they're like, do you want to eat niacinamide? Or, and it's like, it sounds like a felony, right? And it's like it's actually just like a
Sounds like
form
a
of vitamin
Japanese
B.
felony, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a form of vitamin B. It's fine. It's
Yeah.
in meat. It's in regular meat too. But you can demonize this stuff and it's like it's frankenfood.
Yeah.
Look, if
You're
something
eating
is
a
found to
tumor.
be, sorry.
You're eating a tumor, is what I've heard
Yeah.
quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like all those old jokes about what was it called? Like, dihydrogen oxide, right? And it's like it's a killer. It like kills people every year and it's water, right? But it sounds really nasty, you know.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what you were saying about funding, I mean,
Mhm.
clearly in 5 years ago, a lot of money was going into this because it was the new thing. It was kind of hyped. It was the AI of its time, but it had a short lifespan, really.
Yeah.
But I mean, I suppose can sometimes if you are short of funds, if your funding is tight, it sort of focuses the mind a little bit. So I actually believe it's not hasn't been such a terrible thing for the industry to start thinking we need more scientists than we need PR people right now, or or we need to sort of concentrate the funds we have on the important stuff, and it's
I
not such a terrible thing.
I think that's a great point, right? That sort of necessity is the mother of invention. And you
Yeah,
definitely saw some of the, cultivated meat is a perfect example in your world, where some of these companies that raised tons of money really struggled out of the gate. And then in 2021, right, this report came out, this scientific report that said cultivated meat will never work. The classic example was the cost of the media that they feed to the cells. And
yeah,
this report said it'll never get it'll probably be about $6 a liter. It'll never get lower than 250. It would have to get to a dollar a liter to be cost competitive. And now you've got these like relatively new startups who are like, uh, we're at 7 cents a liter.
yeah,
um, and they said that we would never get to, and it wasn't, and like some of those big guys are, they're below a dollar too. But the real innovation is happening from people who really were on a shoestring. They weren't pouring money into building factories, which, when you think about it, is a kind of strange use of venture capital dollars anyway. And
yeah.
who were these VCs who thought like that was a good idea to, build factories to try to compete with a commodity product? But again, now it's like it's rationalizing. You know, you would think some of these investors would be like, hey, the things I thought a while back are not true, and this is seems investable again. But there does seem to be a herd mentality. VCs, journalists, um, you know,
Yeah.
people seem to follow the crowd.
I think there's still plenty of money there. I mean, it's starting to come back slowly. I think we've hit the bottom. We've been at the bottom of the trough, and I've had this from the horse's mouth of quite a few horses who've
Yeah,
said that we are climbing back up again in regards to sort of funding. So we've seen the worst of it, it seems.
I think
Uh,
so. And
yeah,
and you've started to see governments at least kind of putting their toe in the water, and getting involved. And I
yeah,
think particularly, not to just focus on cultivated meat, but in that industry, it's like a classic example of where, and plant-based meat as well, where all of the science is being done by a few companies in their own silos. And you'd think there would be room for a lot of kind of shared information, that could help everybody. It wouldn't be competitive secrets, so that that everybody doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. I talk about like cultivated meat, and like the joke I always make is like, if you imagine old MacDonald, right? Oh, he had a farm, but then imagine like, right, it's like EIEIO, but you not only do you have to kind of invent the cow, and but you also have to invent the stuff that you're feeding the cow, and then you kind of have to invent the marketing slogans for the cow, and you have to come up with your own distribution system. And
Yeah.
so it's now you're starting to see in cultivated meat a little bit of specialization, the development of an ecosystem, so old McDonald doesn't have to do everything himself. They can they can buy feed from one place. They can buy a bioreactor from somewhere else, or at least they can learn from people who have worked on this stuff, and instead of just doing everything in your own barn.
Yeah. So you say that you've tasted the cultivated meats.
Oh yeah.
Which and what did you taste? I tasted fish a few weeks ago.
From wild type or from
No, it was from Umami Bio
oh,
Works.
okay.
Yeah, in
Uh,
London. Yeah. Yeah.
so I just had some locks from wild type not long ago, and that was terrific. And I
Okay.
was like, you nailed it. And again, they're not making it at scale, so who knows if it's going to be as good when they're mass producing it. But that was fantastic. I've had Upsides chicken fillet, which is 100% chicken meat, and it tastes, not only does it taste like chicken, it tastes better than chicken because they're using cells from the kind of original heritage chickens rather than the chickens that have been bred for fast growth in factory farms. And that was, I said it was like chickenier than chicken. um, I had I had Sci-Fi Foods burger, which was really quite good before they went bust. And they were hitting all their cost targets too. They just couldn't get money to build a factory.
Did they
Um,
get bought up by
I
a
think
Thai company?
their IP might be sitting around, and they were gene editing as well. Like I thought their name was kind of crazy, like Sci-Fi Foods. I think maybe that was just for investors, but I don't know if people are going to want to eat sci-fi food. But in any case, yeah, I've
Yeah.
tried, and then on the plant-based side and the fungi-based side, I've tried a lot of really good products. You've seen like plant-based chicken nuggets are now like they outperform chicken-based chicken nuggets in taste tests. Um,
Yeah.
like granted, God knows what's in an actual chicken nugget anyway, and like these things are just vehicles for sauce. But
Yeah.
there's no longer any reason to eat a chicken nugget, and so hopefully we'll start to see that. Maybe burgers will be next, sausages, and and
Yeah.
again, things
So
change over time.
So how close is I mean obviously there's a lot of hurdles for kind of cellular agriculture in regard to regulatory hurdles and money hurdles and scaling up hurdles and also just kind of attitude to this meat hurdle. So how close from your research are we to having this on the shelves and to being a sort of viable alternative?
Well, I think like in the United States, I think you'll see the first ones on the shelves in the fall. And it will be a viable alternative, in like, 5 years, 10 years.
Yeah,
Um, uh, you know, uh, it's going to take time. And you know, like Vow in Asia is now like they are now making tons of meat, which is like really exciting. They are,
yeah,
they will, next year they'll probably do, I don't know, like triple digit tons of meat, of cultivated meat, which is
and they're
awesome.
making that in Thailand, I think, aren't they? Have they got
Yeah, and they're
to
selling it in Singapore, and they're about to start selling it in
Australia?
Australia,
Yeah,
and this is very exciting. They're making this Japanese quail, like a high-end foie gras type product.
yeah,
And their theory of the case is that we're not going to compete with existing meats. We're going to make exotic meats because, why not? Like maybe it'll taste even better and we can make it healthier. More power to them. They are making tons of meat. But again, the world ate 350 million tons of meat last year. So,
yeah,
like Perfect Day is a company doing fermentation of basically whey proteins, and they make whey, which is great. And they are also making tons. Now they're up to tons. But again, the world had 1 trillion tons of dairy proteins last year. So
Which is you used a sort of metaphor in the book, the of a building in New York. What was this?
yes,
The
yeah.
amount of meat. What was that?
I think it's 1,000 Empire State Buildings
That's right. Yeah,
worth of meat every year.
yeah.
And look, I get it. Like I told you, I cut out beef when I started working on this book, because I wanted to be less of a hypocrite. I wanted to do my part. Look, I have solar panels and an electric vehicle, but I also fly too much. So I thought this would be, again, better is better than worse. But also people told me that I wouldn't miss it, and I totally miss it. And when
Mm.
I did a bunch of reporting on some cattle ranches in Brazil, and I completely fell off the wagon and had some delicious steaks, the local steaks, and so like I get it. I think, and most people aren't right. Most people aren't working on a book about food and agriculture and the climate. So I just think these things are going to be hard. These things are going to take time. But like for instance, the United States, we eat on average, the average American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. And if that was only two, like if you swapped one of them out for an Impossible Burger, you
Mm.
would save a Massachusetts-sized swath of land every year. And so that's not nothing. Um,
So it's
it's
just
not going
about
to solve the whole problem either, but
so
that's how
really,
change
it's
happens.
just about eating less, right?
Less or
Because we can't produce more, so we must start eating less meat.
Well, we also can. That's part of it is, part of it is less beef, and the vegans are like, yeah, yeah, that's right, Grunwald. And then I say, but also we need to produce more efficient beef. And actually, what I saw in Brazil is I saw ranches that had gone from having 1 cow on every 5 acres to 2 cows per acre. So they were suddenly 10 times as efficient. And that meant they were using 1/10 as much of the Amazon. And to me, that's really exciting. And that's part of the solution as well. If beef was only like 3 times as bad as chicken instead of 10 times, that would be an incredible, that would be a revolution in in our approach to the land.
Mm.
But that said, like, you know, if the owner of that ranch wanted to get paid in today's carbon markets, the smartest thing he could do would be redegrade the ranch. Because again, the current carbon markets, the way we account for climate, we ignore land. And this is all about land, right? That guy, right now, he has more cows on his property, so he has more methane emissions, and he's fertilizing his pastures, so he has more nitrous oxide emissions. He gets no credit for the fact that he's saving thousands of acres of the Amazon. And I just think we need to fix the incentives, fix the accounting, and then, yeah, fix the politics a little bit. And to the extent we can, fix our behaviors.
So, when I've written articles on this topic, I've often been accused of being a bit negative. So your book, would you say it's a sort of positive? Is it a positive message, or is it a message of doom?
It's definitely not a message of doom. I really tried to not be a Debbie Downer. It was funny, like the New Yorker just did a review of the book, and it was lovely. It said great things, but kind of one critique was that I keep saying that I'm not a Debbie Downer, but then I describe all these very promising solutions. That this was her words. She said, and they turn out to be they haven't panned out. So she says, and they turn out to be duds. And there are examples like Beyond Meat and some alternative fertilizers and this kind of miracle tree I write about called Pangamia. And her thing is like, see, they're duds. Why, he's like trying to put a happy face on this, but and my feeling is like, they're not duds. They just haven't panned out yet. Right. And that means they probably need more work, better technology, more innovation, more investment. But some of this stuff is going to work, and so I'm really optimistic about that. But I don't pretend that anything has really worked yet.
Mhm.
None of
Okay.
these solutions have gotten to scale, and I am definitely waving my arms and saying like, "Hey, we have got to get this stuff to work fast," because we, the real climate questions are going to be solved or not solved over these next few decades.
Yeah. As a last question, I want to pose you something quite existential. You talked about the last green revolution, and this being perhaps a new revolution. To what extent do you think what change might come as a result of all this new technology and all and this kind of necessity? To what extent do you think it might change human behavior and it might change, our how we see our relationship with animals and the planet?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's that's one of the things that sucks about global warming, right, and climate change generally, is that it's people say like we need to fight this like it's World War II. But in World War II, like, Pearl Harbor got bombed. London was being, destroyed. It was like we saw the enemy. We were in fear for our lives. It was a clear existential threat. While global warming is this more insidious threat that isn't going to kill us all tomorrow, and our kind of our sort of now focused species is not so good at really kind of banding together to fight threats like that. What we're pretty good at solving immediate problems, and then we kind of muddle through. So honestly, I don't think there's going to be this kind of epiphany where the world says like, this kind of like battleship victory, where we, sign the treaty on the battleship and it's like we have now conquered the food and climate problem, or we are no longer, we are going to change our relationship to animals. I think it's more like, we're going to get to better technologies and it's like, oh, well, there's something better than chicken nuggets. And now there's something better than burgers. And at some point, maybe there will be something better or at least competitive with meat. And then over time, it's kind of like, hey, and what were we thinking killing 70 billion animals a year, right? And then there'll be a time when we'll look back at it like, that was crazy. We were using 70% of our fresh water for agriculture. Holy shit. Um, uh,
Yeah,
but uh, but I think the change is going to have to come, sort of gradually and not organically. It's going to have like it takes work. That's what I keep saying. Is that
yeah,
it would be nice if these things were the sort of natural, the natural trajectory of things, right? The what is it? The moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Like it doesn't bend towards plant-based meat. And it doesn't bend towards gene edited fertilizers or reinvented photosynthesis. Like people got to invent that shit, and that's going to be really hard, and it's going to take government investment, and it's going to take the right kind of policies, and it's going to take a little bit of cultural change, in that at least we can't just be like, ew, that's the devil. It's gonna, it's Franken this and Franken that.
yeah.
And so that's gonna, like, I don't rely on the kind of human psyche changing a lot, but again, I do expect, economic and technological and behavioral and ultimately political change, to hopefully drive us in the direction we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that that would be the ideal. But I mean, how convinced are you that kind of government uh, assistance will happen, especially with the kind of change of administration in your country there? You know,
Well, it ain't going to happen for the next 4 years. I mean, at least on the government side in the U.S. But one joke I make, but it's actually serious, is that the people who work in energy and climate, and look, I used to be one of those people. They're all tearing their hair out right now because it's like this is horrible. This guy's going to roll back all this progress we've made.
mm,
The kind of good news is that in food there really hasn't been any progress to roll back.
right.
Um,
Okay.
and this is a time like what I talk about. I said at the beginning about how we've kind of figured out energy, and we know what to do, and it's just a question of political will, whether we're gonna, how fast we're going to do it.
Mm,
Um, Now we have not figured out food. I try to sort of hint at some directions, but now is a good time to start to figure this stuff out, so that when there is kind of the political leadership in place that can actually act on this stuff, we at least know what we can tell them to do.
Yeah.
Right now, if we told them, if you had somebody trying to do the right thing, Biden actually cared a lot about agriculture and climate. And almost all of his investment in that area was, in my opinion, towards either useless or actually harmful stuff, that you would have promoted lower yield agriculture,
Mm.
that would use more acres to make food. So I think this is a good time to have this conversation, at least to say, like, hey, what do we need? What are some things that we need to figure out what it works? What do we know already works? And what, most importantly, what do we know doesn't work so that we don't, go down that path?
Yes. Well, that's a good note to leave it on, I think. So, your book, "We Are Eating the Earth," that's out in July, and it's available on all usual
Yeah.
sites.
You can click and pre-order it right now. and
Okay, okay.
um,
And so it's been wonderful talking to you, Michael, and I hope to talk to you again. And thanks for coming on Future Foods Interviews.
I really appreciate it. And you're doing great work. Like I keep saying about how we need to have these conversations, and it's a conversation you've been having for a while. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that too. Thank you. Speak again soon. Bye bye for now.
Thank you.